So I invite and I welcome today's chairperson, Dr. Ashok MV, on behalf of Indian Psychiatric Society and Team Tele Arogya, sir. I welcome you, sir, Dr. Ashok MV, sir. And I welcome today's speaker, Dr. Vasudha Rao, my friend, and who works in NI Hospital, NI Psychiatry Services at Mysuru. I welcome you, Vasudha, on behalf of Indian Psychiatric Society and Team Tele Arogya. I welcome today moderators of this series Indian Psychiatric Society, as well as our EC member, Dr. Harish Kulkarni, for this series. I welcome Narayan and Harish. And the man behind this is none other than Dr. Mahesh Koda, the director of the Telearogya team, who has it is his brainchild. So I welcome Dr. Mahesh Koda in his absentia, and I welcome all the participants for this the third series of the psychopathology series. And I welcome Dr. Miss Binoy from Icon Laboratories. Now I would like to ask the moderator, Dr. Narayan Motalik, to take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Dr. Somshakar Bijja, sir. So let me start with the introduction of our chairperson. Actually, it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Ashok Mysuru, who is currently working as Professor of Psychiatry at St. John's Medical College Hospital, Bangalore, and Head Care ADD. That is, he developed child mental health services at St. John's Medical College Hospital from 1994 onwards, and he has been a core member of St. John's Center for Children with Special Needs, a multidisciplinary center called Unit of Hope within St. John's Medical College Hospital from 2004 onwards. And he coordinates training here and runs an autism clinic in this center, that is St. John's Medical College Hospital. And he recently in August 2019 launched CARE ADD, that is Center for Advanced Research and Excellence in Autism and Developmental Disorders within Unit of Hope, aiming to understand the biological underpinnings of autism. And sir is a part of two ICMR studies on autism, completed one on clinical and neuropsychological study of ASD in India. And he has just validated a new screening tool for identifying autism in children below 18 months. And he has been in the task force of ICMR to develop a culturally valid Indian instrument for anxiety and panic disorders. And he is currently validating a newly developed tool for adolescent depression. And he has been a part of a WHO study to develop tool for depression in the Indian context. And he is a part of ICMR multicentric study on metabolic syndrome in schizophrenia. And there are many studies for his credit on developing an IT platform-based ASD surveillance as well as task shift models for early intervention for ASD in India within CARE ADD. And there's open part of open autism research into obstetrics, placenta, and epigenetics and neurodevelopment in autism, which is a major program planned from CARE ADD. And he has PhD students under his guidance and published many articles in the area of alcoholism and insight in psychosis. And he has been working on UG undergraduate and postgraduate psychiatry training for a long time. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation as a chairperson. I welcome Dr. Ashok Mysuru, and over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Narayan. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this function. It's the best part of any teacher's life is, having more and more opportunities to talk with many different students. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm glad to see that there are so many who have actually participating on this, and there must be many more on YouTube. So it's really nice to be with all of you this evening. So it's disorders of perception is probably one of the earliest things that a postgraduate tries to get to know of, because when you enter psychiatry, the first symptom that really captures your attention is hallucination. And yeah, funnily, by the time you come to the exams, people have actually not really systematically recalling how actually you'll go about assessing perceptual disorders. It's very common It's one of the things that gives you an entry into psychiatry, and then you become so familiar with it and you get so used to recognizing it in patients. But when it comes to actually systematic evaluation, the first 3 months and the last 3 months of your training test, you give a lot of extra focus on that. And yeah, so it's one part of it is, it seems like simpler compared to things like formal thought disorder and stuff like that. On the other hand, we probably need to be very systematic in trying to confirm that indeed a disorder of perception exists. And I think to tell us more about this very core psychopathological issue today, we have with us Dr. Vasudha Rao. I'll just share screen to introduce her. I mean, it's yeah. Dr. Vasudha Rao has, she's been in clinical practice in different parts of the South Zone, as it were, in the last 10 years. After completing her medical studies from Tumkur and then her psychiatric studies from Father Muller's College, she's actually worked for some time in Namma, Bengaluru for a few years. She kind of was part of, she's worked as a consultant in many hospitals in Bangalore. See that there you go, 3 hospitals, Padmanabh Nagar, Basavangudi, Banshankari. So she's been in South Bangalore for almost 5 years after her qualification. And then she actually has moved on to Kerala, where she's worked in a large hospital, managing a lot of inpatient and outpatient load. This particular hospital in Kannur is, I got a personal connection with that, because one of our students from St. John's actually started off this hospital, Dr. Vinita. And the other day when I was talking to Dr. Vasudha, she was explaining about her work there. Yeah, so she's worked there for a long time, and she's done something fantastic, which I find even today very difficult to do. She's picked up Malayalam, and she's now even put that in her slides there. So she must be very good with Malayalam now. So she's picked up languages, she's walked around, and then she found that you can't keep going around to different places to see different places and patients in different places. So she's decided to get into telepsychiatry and telepsychotherapy, which seems to offer her the whole world, as it were, to connect with and to share her expertise and support people across the world. That's wonderful. That's really the way to go. And it's exciting to see youngsters moving into these kind of challenging areas. She works now as a consultant psychiatrist at Unoya Mind Clinic, which is the tele-psychiatry organization in Mysore. But she also runs face-to-face consultation services at Vinayaka Hospital, did you say?
Viveka, sir. Viveka
Hospital in Mysore. Yeah, and she's there along with Dr. Murali Krishna. So we can see that she's moved around, she's thought over it, she's tried to reach out to more and more people. And so it's wonderful to have you today with us, Dr. Vasudha, and we look forward to hearing you tell all of us about the disorders of perception and how we go about assessing it and understanding it. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. So when I told Ashok sir that I'm not an academician and I'm exclusively into private practice, he said that's not an issue at all, because Andrew Sims was not an academician either. So that was very informative and very thoughtful of sir to say that to me at that point of time. So I will move on to this. I'll try to share the screen. So I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am.
We have to ask this fundamental perception today before studying the disorders of perception as to what is perception. So when the stimulus comes to the sensory organs, so we are trying to differentiate between what is a sensation and what is a perception. So sensation is, it's a raw stimulus. For example, photons from the light, where it falls upon a rose and it gets reflected and falls upon the retina of a person. So that is a raw stimulus. From there, the receptors in the retina pass on this information to the cortex. So that is the sensory information which is passed on to the brain. The brain actually what it does is it assigns a meaning to this stimulus, meaning to this sensory information which is coming in through various sensory organs. So we all know that perception is influenced by many, many things. So it is influenced by attention, it is influenced by our memory, it is influenced by our current emotional state, it is influenced by the context where this perception is occurring, and it is influenced by the cultural expectations, the conditioning, and it also depends on the prior experience, similar experience, which is related to this stimulus, or prior concepts, or internal mental templates, which are influencing this perception process. So raw stimulus is perceived with all these multiple influences by the brain. That is exactly why Oliver Sacks said, he's one of my favorite writers. So here we are not given the world, we make our own world. So whatever we see, the perspective, how we perceive what we see is very important. So here we see a caricature where the person standing on the island is very happy to see a boat, and the person coming in the boat is very happy to see the land. So what the stimulus means to us, the meaning is given by the brain. Together and perceive it as a cat. So the brain is doing and integrating the various parts of the whole. So this is where the perception becomes very, very important. So he can see the cat, but he cannot perceive it as a cat. He cannot name it as a cat. But then the same patient used to do another very curious thing. He used to close his eyes and touch the cat, all the parts one by one. And he used to go instantly, closing his eyes, he used to go instantly and say, this is a cat. So the sensation and perception, so they're not the same. So the brain has a lot of work to do to give a meaning to what it perceives. So there are many models of how the brain perceives the external world. So there are two models. One is the bottom-up processing, and the other one is top-down processing. Bottom-up is, it is taking a lot of sensory information, it is taking the context, it is taking all the inputs which is coming to it, and it is assembling it, and it is integrating it as a whole, and then think about it, what am I seeing? So suppose you're seeing an elephant. So you would see the trunk, you would see the belly, you would see the small tail that it has, you would see large feet, and then think, okay, this is an elephant. In the reverse process, there's another model which tries to explain perception, which is a top-down processing. It uses pre-existing templates, for example, models, ideas, and its expectations. So it uses it and tries to make sense of what it's seeing. So, for example, you may see a logo, probably of a popular brand, but half of the brand may not be visible. So you will think about it and see, is this something that I have seen before? Then yes, yeah, probably, yeah, that's it. So that is a top-down processing of perception. So now we come to our topic at hand, that is disorders of perception, which is divided into sensory deceptions and sensory distortions. So sensory deceptions, which are very clinically very important to us, one is illusion and the other one is hallucination. So Cutting in 1997 defined this as perceived object is correctly recognized. For example, if a person is seeing a cat, he is seeing a cat. He knows that it's a cat and it's identified. Yet there is a deviation from its customary appearance. Yet there is something different about this cat without prejudicing the knowledge of the kind of thing it is. So it doesn't change his impression that it's a cat, but then there's something off charts about what he's seeing. So this is what is defined as a sensory distortion. So distortions are further divided into distortions in the intensity of the perception, quality of the perception, spatial form, and the disorders in the experience of time. So we will first consider the intensity part of it. So hypoesthesia and hyperesthesia. So a perception might be perceived as being very bright or very loud or very sharp. For example, flowers seem very bright, so that is hyperesthesia. Hypoesthesia means the flower appear very dull. For example, for a depressed person, the whole world appears very dull. So hypoesthesia can occur or hyperesthesia can occur. Coming to changes in quality of perception, it can be influenced by many toxic substances like mescaline, digitalis, and it can induce specific colors, especially in the visual field. The whole entire vision is perceived as colored by yellow. It's called xanthopsia. Colored with green color, so it's called fluoropsia. If it is colored by red, it is called erythropsia. So this can also happen in the quality of perception. It can also happen in derealization, because whatever we see, we are seeing the real world. We are perceiving the real world, but somehow it appears very unreal, as if it's not real, and it appears very strange. And in mania, everything looks very perfect and beautiful owing to the elevated affect. So this can also, the distortion can also occur in the experience of time. For example, I had a very pleasant experience today typing all this content and going through the material to prepare this, so that I did not know how the time flew by. So it's such a beautiful topic. So whenever we are enjoying something that we are doing, we will not know how the time goes. So happy times usually fly. Suppose I'm waiting in a line for probably a passport. So it's very boring and the line seems never ending. I keep looking at my watch, but then I know that it's just been 5 minutes. Then I keep staring at my phone. So whatever we find unpleasant, and whenever we are very bored, or whenever we are feeling very low, the time appears to slow down. So this is a normal universal experience. So what happens in serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia? Time perception can be radically altered in these conditions. So time can be experienced to be moving in fits and gaps, as if the time stops and then suddenly the time rushes. So a patient might have a internal, subject to experience of time being irregular, as if it is arrhythmic. Then comes what we have seen in schizophrenia. I have also seen a couple of patients with age disorientation, and also age disorientation. They will be suppose if a patient is about 50 years old, he still thinks he's 35 years old. And I had a patient who still believed that Morarji Desai was the premier of India. So everything else in his time, place, person, the orientation is perfect. He is perfectly conscious. There is absolutely no neurologic disorder. There is no organic antecedents for this kind of disorientation. But there seems to be some issue with the way the person experiences time in schizophrenia. So they will be stuck somewhere in the past. So they will be much younger in their own opinion. So changes can occur in spatial form also. This is very interesting. It is called dysmegalopsia. So any perceived change in size of an object that a person perceives. So that is defined as dysmegalopsia by Hamilton. And Sims defined it a little bit differently. saying if you're perceiving an apple, for example, so the one side appears larger than the other side. So that is what Sims refers to as dysmegalopsia. So it is not a general, change in size, but he is telling that one side can be larger than the other for the person seeing it. Then comes metamorphopsia. If any perceived irregularity in the shape of objects that we see or feel or touch. So this can also result generally in the visual field from the retinal disease, disorders of accommodation and convergence. And we know that atropine and hyoscine, these do tend to cause this kind of distorted vision. It can also occur in temporal and parietal lesions. Coming to the disorders of visual perception, this list appears very long, but it's very interesting. Each one of them is very interesting. Micropsia is where what we see appears much smaller than it actually is. So it is something like Alice in Wonderland. So she sees a very small rabbit. The whole world looks very small to her in the novel. So macropsia, it's the exact opposite. Everything appears really large and probably might even scare the patient. So hemimicropsia is another condition where if you keep an object in one of the quadrants of the eye, it can appear of a different size. But that same thing doesn't hold good for the other quadrant. So metamorphopsia, then visual hyperesthesia, where the colors appear very bright. And the converse is achromatopsia. The whole world appears devoid of color. The vision appears devoid of color. And some objects may appear farther than they really are, and sometimes the objects may appear closer than they are. And then the achinotopsia is a very interesting phenomenon, which I have only read, not really seen, but it's a failure to appreciate the movement. For example, if a patient is pouring water from a jug, she's not able to stop at the right moment when the glass fills because she cannot perceive the movement of the water. So she continues pouring the water. So these are the visual perceptual disturbances. Now we come to the very prominent and very important distortions of auditory sensations. So hyperacusis and hyperacusis and palinacusis. Hyperacusis is when we hear sounds much louder than they actually are. For example, for a patient with migraine, so a small sound may appear very loud and the patient may feel her pain shooting up. So there is a hyperacusis happening there. And there is also hypoacusis. It can happen in depression. It can happen in the disorders of the ear. So the patient cannot hear the sounds in their actual volume. There's another interesting phenomenon like palinacusis, where the auditory stimulus ceases after a certain point of time, but then the patient continues to hear it. For example, you might hear a bell ringing. The bell stops after for about 30 seconds or so, but you continue to hear it for the next 10 minutes. If that happens, it is called palinacusis. Coming to the same, we will take the same concept into palinaptia, where suppose I am holding my mobile phone for 2 seconds, but then even if I close my eyes after 5 minutes, I still feel that I am holding my phone in my hand, although I'm not holding it. So the tactile sensation is still perceived by the brain, although the stimulus has ceased. So sensory deceptions have been divided into illusions and hallucinations. Illusions are a misinterpretation of the stimulus arising from the external object. Stimuli from the perceived object are combined with a mental image to produce a false perception. Here, the patient has a real stimulus, but the stimulus is misinterpreted. So the patient is aware that it's an external object, stimulus is arising, and externally, but then patient misinterprets. So, for example, illusion, if you're walking on a dark road, you might think that some shadows on the road are actually somebody following you. So that is an illusion. Even though nobody might be following, we will look at the shadow and think that the shadow might be the shadow of a person. So Sims defined 3 types of illusions. One is completion illusion, second one is affect illusions, and the third is pareidolia. Completion illusion, it occurs to all of us every day. For example, the first, the picture there, the triangle. Although the second triangle is not actually seen, our brain constructs 2 intersecting triangles in this graphic. So our brain completes the lines which are not there. So this is a type of illusion which is called a completion illusion. An affect illusion, anybody who has experienced grief, the loss of a loved one, we all know that, sometimes we feel that the person is, talking to us, or we can see the person. Suppose we are in a temple festival, we might see the deceased person's face in the crowd. So this is an affect illusion. We definitely know that the person is deceased, so there is no way that this person is going to come in the temple for the darshan, but then we feel that he looks like that, the face appears like that in the crowd. Pareidolia is a very vivid kind of illusion where we see, here you can see I'm sure you can see the rock face, but we don't just see the rock face, isn't it? We also see a robust, probably African elephant here. So how does the brain see an elephant there? So the brain has a vivid imagery which comes on its own, involuntarily, whenever we see an object. So this is called as pareidolia. Now coming to hallucinations, which is very important, but I would like to go back to Esquirol for some time because I'm sort of interested in history of this topic. Then also I'm into psychotherapy, so Esquirol is very interesting to me. He was a French psychiatrist. He was a student of Philippe Pinel. So this was about 2 centuries ago. So Esquirol has done a lot of things for us psychiatrists, to be honest. So he established a private asylum in France for mentally ill people. And he was also responsible for pooling all the hallucinations in different modalities. For example, visual, tactile, and auditory, and all the different sensory modalities. So he was the one who pooled it and said that this is all hallucination. So he coined the word hallucination. Then he insisted on medicalization of insanity. So otherwise we wouldn't be these psychiatrists treating these psychiatric conditions now. So he was the first person who did that. So he had a very simple definition of hallucinations. It's a perception without an object. It's very simple. Everybody could easily remember it. Then came Jaspers, the German psychiatrist, who defined it in a more elaborate manner. Hallucinations proper are false perceptions. They're not the real perceptions. Real because if the object is there and the brain perceives it, then it's a real perception. But if it's a false perception, there is no object, but the brain is still perceiving this particular object. So that are not in any way distortions of real perception. So it is definitely not an illusion. Illusion is a distortion of real perception. And they spring up on their own. So the patient is not willing these percepts to happen. So the person is not willing this to happen. So, and they appear as something quite new. And they can occur simultaneously along the real perception. So we will see this in special hallucinations where there's a real perception and there is a false perception, which are simultaneously co-occurring. So this definition was given by Jaspers. Hallucination, moving to the next definition, it was given by Smithies. A hallucination is an extraceptive or an introceptive percept that doesn't correspond to the real object. So the perception is not at all corresponding to the real object. So that was the definition given by Smithies. The last was given by Cutting. A hallucination is a perception without an object or appearance of an individual thing in the world without a corresponding material event. So there is no stimulus happening, yet the brain is perceiving the stimulus. And a more elaborate definition, rather Slade had 3 criteria which are essential for an operational definition of a hallucinations. So he had 3 criteria. One is percept-like experience in absence of a stimulus. We already saw that this is a common factor in all the definitions that we studied till now. Percept-like experience that has full force and impact of real perception. So it's as good as a real perception. So the brain perceives the actual stimulus and the zero stimulus to be the same. Percept-like experience that is unwilled, occurs spontaneously, and cannot be readily controlled by the participant. So it is unwilled and it is involuntary. So these 3 definition criteria are finally, they are fundamentally derived from Jaspers' formal characteristics of a normal perception. So again, we are using this abnormal to normal extrapolation. So formal characteristics of normal perception and imagery, which was given by Jaspers, 1962. So Jaspers, I digress a bit. I hope you tolerate it because Jaspers is very, very impressive. He was a German psychiatrist. So he was basically interested in philosophy when he was a child. But then his father told him that you can study law. So he went into law. And then he did not like law. He got into medicine and then he got into psychiatry. And then from psychiatry, ultimately, he did deviate back into philosophy, his original love of his life. So in the end, he remained a philosopher rather than a clinician. So this is a very beautiful and very succinct table which differentiate between perceptions and imagery. So perceptions are always concrete reality. So there is a stimulus and the brain is perceiving it as such. Whereas in imagery, it is a figurative thing and it has a character of subjectivity. So if I tell you to imagine any elephant, I'm sure every person in the audience will imagine a subtly different kind of elephant. So the imagery is different. So it is subjective. Then perceptions occur in external objective space. So the brain knows that this is a stimulus which is coming from the outside world. For example, the rose that I am seeing is in the external, the light is coming from the external objective space. So I perceive the rose to be outside. But then when we imagine something, the images appear in an inner subjective space. It occurs in our mind. Perceptions, third point is perceptions are very clearly delineated. Whereas in images, they're incomplete and very poorly delineated. So they don't have the clarity that real perceptions have. The sensory elements are full and fresh. So if I'm perceiving a beautiful sunny morning, it is full and fresh as I witness it. Whereas the sensory elements in images are relatively insufficient, the detailing, so it's insufficient. Perceptions are constant and they remain unaltered. Whereas images tend to dissipate and they have to be reconstructed. So the last, perceptions are independent of our will. Images are dependent of our will. So there is a willingness, whether the patient wills it or not. So he had a very clear idea of this differentiation between perceptions and images. Then comes the definition of Horowitz, who said these images, the perceptions occur in the form of mental images and they're derived from internal sources of information. But although it is a perception which is occurring from internal sources, the person appraises it incorrectly as occurring as in an external source. Although I am hearing voices in an internal space, I attribute it, I apprise it that this voice is coming from my neighbor's house. So it is apprised incorrectly as an external source of information. And it occurs intrusively. I do not wish to hear this voice, but it is coming on its own. It intrudes upon my other thought processes. And we are coming to the next very interesting part, which was the examination of sense of reality as a person hallucinates. So this was studied by Agarnes. So he studied this and distilled it into 6 points, the sense of reality that the patient experiences. So he distinguished between perceiving versus imagining. It is the same, the perceiving and imagining, it is the same in normal perception. So the person is perceiving it in the same way as a normal perception. Even the hallucination appears very real to him. And then there's an objectivity. So regarding being able to experience the same object with another modality of sensation. Suppose I am hearing voices from the road adjacent to my house. I am very sure that if I go out and stand in the balcony, I will be able to see the car which is producing this noise, which I'm hearing as a auditory hallucination. So there is an objectivity regarding the sensory modalities. So the third point is this object is considered to exist. Although I may see a rose where there is no rose, I'm actually having a visual hallucination. But then I really think that there is a rose which I'm seeing. So the object is considered to exist in external reality. And this experience of false perception, it is involuntary. And there's a quality of independence. So the patient feels that this is not because of my mood, it is not because of my mental state. It is occurring independent of the current mental state. So no matter how the patient is feeling currently, he will continue to experience this hallucination. And there's an element of publicness. So the patient feels that only he can hear this hallucination. Only he can hear these voices. This point is the most interesting point amongst the all 6 points that Agarnes is given, according to me. So, because there have been patients where I have asked them, if your neighbor is, commenting upon all your actions, do you think your family members are able to hear it? So I have had patients who have said, no, they cannot hear it, only I can hear it. And there have been patients who say that, of course, they hear it. They hear the whole thing. So then when we ask them, why don't they react to it? You get angry, you go and fight with the neighbor and all these things. Why doesn't your mother do the same? Why doesn't your father do the same? But then the patient always replies, there will be a delusional elaboration to this perception. Like, they are sympathetic to that neighbor. They don't want to have fights with him. That guy was my father's friend, so he cannot publicly counter him. But they do hear what I hear. So then there was another lady who used to feel that the neighbor is against her, and she used to hear this neighbor who used to comment on all the household chores that she was doing, a lady neighbor. So then I asked her, she was an unmarried woman living with her old mother. So then I asked her, why does your mother hear it? Mother was very aged. So her hearing may not be sharp. So that aroused my curiosity. And then I asked her, does your mother hear the same thing that you do? And she said, it's obvious, isn't it? If I can hear it, she can hear it too. Then I asked her, why doesn't she react? Why doesn't she go and tell this woman, stop bothering my daughter? Then she said, isn't it obvious? She is mixed up with this woman. So she is like an instrument. Whatever the neighbor says, my mother believes it, and my mother also persecutes me. So patients have different ways of perceiving this publicness of their private experience of a hallucination. So with each patient, the interpretation will be different, and it will be interesting with every patient that we see. So coming to auditory hallucinations, now that we are halfway into it. So now when we say elementary hallucinations, it is usually non-speech kind of sound. Probably a train chugging along, whistle, or wind blowing, or taps on the table. So anything which is not speech, which is elementary hallucination. Coming to the Charles Bonnet syndrome, I will be coming to this in the future slides in more detail. And we all know, whoever has studied schizophrenia, like Ashok sir said, so this is what we learn in the initial days. Before learning the criteria for schizophrenia, we would have learned what is the first person, second person, and the third person hallucination. So second person hallucination is when the hallucinatory voice is talking to us, talking to the patient. Third person hallucination is when the two voices are talking to each other. And then some researchers like Green and Preston, they felt that it is patients who are experiencing auditory hallucinations are actually vocalizing it in non-audible volumes. So they did an experiment. They did a thing to find out that this was indeed true. Some of them were actually vocalizing the content of the hallucination that they were hearing. So Slade goes on to trying to explain why this actually happens, why these hallucinations happen. He says that it is a result of vivid mental imagery and poor reality testing. So the patient cannot or is unable to test whether it's a real stimulus or not. And his own mind is coming up with vivid mental imagery, which is this combination is resulting in a hallucination. So another very interesting experiment done by Warren and Langdon. This is called verbal transformation effect. So this was done with a mixture of normal subjects and the subjects who were actively hallucinating. So they used the word tress 360 times in a span of 30 seconds. So 3 minutes. So this verbal stimulus, this auditory stimulus, was widely reproduced differently by the normal subjects and the persons who were hallucinating. So at least the normal people had some connection to the linguistic components of the word, which was repeated many, many times in a short span of time. But then the subjects who were hallucinating had entirely different words from what they heard. Patients with schizophrenia, so they're known to have impaired cognitive processing in aspects of tolerance and ambiguity. So they do not process the entire stimulus fully, and they come to a premature judgment. So what meanings they give the stimulus, it is very fixed. So they do not consider alternative meanings for their perceptions. So they have a premature judgment happening there. Coming to Kurt Snyder's first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia. So amongst the first-rank symptoms, 3 types of auditory hallucinations are included in the list of first-rank symptoms. One is audible thoughts, where a person hears his own thoughts being spoken aloud. I had a patient whose thoughts were not only spoken aloud, but they were flashed across the cloud, like a billboard. So not only hearing, he could also see his thoughts written for everybody to see on the clouds. Voices which are heard arguing with each other, usually persecutory content against the patient, plotting to kill him, plotting to poison him, and how he should be tortured. So generally the voices argue with each other. So this is what is third person auditory hallucinations. voices which are commenting on the person's behavior. For example, it is very much like cricket commentary or any other sports commentary where the commentator gives us verbal updates as to what is happening on the field. So a person, a housewife who's washing the dishes may keep hearing the voice from the neighbor or from a relative that, she's washing the dishes now. Now she switches on the stove. Now she keeps a bowl of milk for heating. So the voices will keep commenting on every single action of the patient. Coming to coping mechanisms of patients to deal with auditory hallucinations. So, how do patients deal with this very intrusive, involuntary phenomena? We know that we can relate this intrusiveness and involuntary thing to the obsessions. We know how distressed they feel. Okay. At least there is some reality testing which is intact, but here there is no reality testing which is intact. So they perceive it to be a very real thing. So some patients are known to change posture whenever they hear a voice or whenever they hear the voices commenting upon them, third person auditory hallucination or any kind of auditory hallucination. When it occurs, they tend to change posture. If they're lying down, they tend to sit up, and they tend to seek the company of others so that they use it as a distraction, or they would like to seek safety of others when there is a threatening voice which is scaring them. Changes in physiologic arousal can also be used by patients. So I have a patient who is doing well on medication, a patient with schizophrenia. So he says that his exercise has helped him a lot. Otherwise, there are these voices which are continuously questioning him about his job and his performance, and that he is not good enough. So there are voices which will never leave him relax. So he goes for exercise, and he says that when he is jogging, the emotional impact of these voices tend to be much lesser on him. And there are patients who experience a sense of relief with relaxation too. Patients also employ cognitive methods like control of attention. They when they're hearing these voices, they try not to pay much attention to it. They try to distract their attention to it, and they try to actively suppress their emotional responses to these hallucinations. Coming to the visual hallucinations, these occur mostly in the organic states. This can also occur in psychiatric disorders, but then they're mostly found in organic states. Like left occipital lobe tumors, they're known to have a starburst effect in the right visual field, in the contralateral visual field. Dyslexia and alexia can happen in dominant hemisphere lesions and cortical blindness, where the patient cannot recognize letters. So, and also in post-concussional states where there is a head injury and the patient has a visual hallucination. And also post-seizure, post-ictal period, post-ictal phase, where a person can have visual hallucinations, can really get frightened, can also get violent, can act upon these hallucinations. So it can occur in post-ictal phase. It can also occur in hepatic failure. Coming to the Charles Bonnet syndrome, is a very, very, very interesting syndrome. A similar, this refers to the visual modality, but there is also an auditory phenomenon which is very similar to Charles Bonnet syndrome. That is a musical hallucinations in the deaf people. So the features of this syndrome have been described as occurring in elderly persons with normal conscious experience. Only visual hallucinations are occurring. So the consciousness is normal. There is no other psychopathologic symptoms. Exclusively visual hallucination is occurring in these elderly persons. And this occurs in absence of delirium, dementia, and other organic syndromes, psychosis, substance use, and neurologic disorders affecting the central visual cortex. So there is nothing else which is contributing to this visual hallucinations. Reduced vision in these patients is due to eye disease. And what they see is very vivid and distinct images than visual impairment permits. For example, the vision that they describe, it doesn't correspond to the level of visual impairment. So if they really was having a real percept, it wouldn't be so vivid. For example, we had a patient of bilateral cataract who was about 84 years old, a male patient who had bilateral cataract. On top of that, he also had diabetes and diabetic retinopathy. So he had severe visual impairment. But then when he looked up at the sky, he used to see that it was a sea of roses, and he used to see red roses in particular. So he knew that this was impossible and this was not real. But then he became very concerned. So when he was admitted in the ophthalmology department for treatment, psychiatric referral was given. Finally, when the referral was, when we went to see this patient, it was a very beautiful description of what he sees in the sky. It is like, it is like a bed of roses. Whenever he looks up at the sky, he can see the red roses strewn all over. So, but he was very concerned and he was very scared that, that he might be affected mentally and it could be a mental illness, although he knew very well that this is impossible and it is unreal. So going through a bit of history because it's very, very, very interesting. So Charles Bonnet actually found this syndrome in his own grandfather, Charles Lulin. So at the age of 87 years, his grandfather was having very vivid hallucinations. So he said, a respectable man full of health, candor, judgment, and memory. So independently of all impression from without, perceived from time to time. So it is an occasional occurrence, figures of men, women, birds, carriages, and buildings. So he saw a lot of things, but it was intermittent. So he does not know when this is going to come. So it has an involuntary component here. And his brain is a theater whose machine performs scenes. So Charles Bonnet has put it very beautifully in a very poetic language that this whole hallucinations is being projected from the brain of the person suffering from it. So there is no external stimulus, but the brain is like a theater. So it is giving these vivid scenes to the patient. So it can be spectacular for the patient to see, and it used to surprise the patient. Coming to the hallucinations of bodily sensation, various methods, various types have been described. One is thermic, where the patient feels like hot liquid is being poured all over the body. For example, some patients of schizophrenia. I have seen one patient of schizophrenia, probably about 70-year-old male, who used to get admitted to the ward intermittently once in 3 months or 4 months because for the specific reason of getting a bath in the ward. So the nurses used to give him a bath, and he used to be like a person without a home. And then we found out that he has a very good family. He has a son and he has a daughter-in-law. But then when we dug deep into his complaints, we found that he believed that his daughter-in-law used to pour acid into the bathing water. So whenever he pours the water, even the cold water he pours over his body, to feel that his body was burning as if he's bathing it with acid. So there was a thermic component, thermic hallucination happening there. So his body used to heat up whenever he used to bathe. So he refused to bathe. So definitely there's a delusional elaboration to this hallucination in the case that I mentioned. So he used to come to the ward and take bath. That was the reason for the family admitting him into the ward. So second is haptic hallucination. So the sensation of touch, where the patient can feel that the persecutory force or the persecuting person is touching him. Usually it is accompanied by a delusional component. Third is hygric, like the movement of a liquid. The person perceives a movement of a liquid. So generally this like one patient to describe that the blood shoots up from his abdomen to his head, because somebody has done black magic on him. So there is this liquid moving through his body, and it is hot, and it is his own blood. That was his explanation for what he felt. And we all know this paresthesia, it's the pins and needle sensation. So sometimes patients, especially I have seen elderly patients who have dementia, they describe that there is something being mixed in the food, and as a result of it, they have developed paresthesia. So whenever they eat food, they get pins and needle sensation all over the body. And there is also this kinesthetic, so as if the limb is being moved. Or the leg is being moved involuntarily. And also the visceral sensation. Schizophrenia patients have many varieties of interpreting visceral sensations, although visceral sensation is itself limited, like pain or bloating, or limited ways that we can perceive the visceral sensation. But the interpretations given by patients are really fascinating. So the patient may say that, the intestine is twisting round and round, and then there is a displacement of the intestine somewhere, and it comes back. So they describe a lot of bodily sensations. Then formication, which was also referred to as delusional parasitosis. So the patient generally feels that there are small insects or ants or some small animals which are moving around on his body. So they will have this sensation and they will be convinced. So usually formication will have a delusional elaboration. So they will even pick on the skin and try to show you. I had a patient when I was doing MBBS. I was posted in a rural posting. So there was this old man who came into the government hospital OPD. Then he said, I am having this small lice. In Kannada, it is called henu. Maiyalella hen bandidide. So, the lice has infested my entire body, and you got to give me some lotion to kill these lice, like how you give young children lice treatment for the hair. So, and then, he went on to pick the lice from various parts of his body, and try to show me. There was so much picking, there were some wounds on his body all over, because he used to continuously pick them, try to pick the lice out and try to kill them, just like how you would squish a lice in between your... He demonstrated this whole thing during the very short interview. Coming to olfactory hallucinations, we
Dr.
all know
Vasudha?
that...
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Vasudha. Shall we say you can take another 10 minutes? Would that be possible? Yeah, so
Sure,
we can
sir.
have some discussions for 20 minutes after that.
Definitely, sir. Definitely, sir. So coming to the olfactory hallucinations, olfactory memory, we all know that it is connected very powerfully with emotions. For example, the smell of coffee, so it will bring up a lot of memories in your mind. Probably this smell of hot bisibalabat for me. So I would be very happy with that smell. So there's a lot of emotional response which comes to the smell. So similarly, olfactory hallucination is also associated with a strong affective component. It also occurs in the epileptic aura, and the smell may be pleasant or unpleasant. Usually, persons affected with depression, sometimes they may have this delusion and olfactory hallucination where they feel that they're smelling totally unpleasant. So it has to have an emotional relevance to the patient. Gustatory hallucinations also can occur. It can occur as a part of aura, especially in temporal lobe epilepsy, and it can also occur in schizophrenia, where the patient suspects that the food tastes very strange. So, and it is elaborated with the delusion that the food is being poisoned. We all know about the alcoholic hallucinations. So it occurs during or within 48 hours of alcohol use, and the delirium has to be excluded in these cases. And mostly this concerns auditory modality. Coming to the pseudo hallucinations, which are the most important differential for the hallucinations. So they are type of mental image, although very clear, very vivid, they cannot be sustained like a true perceptions. So they are also located in the subjective space, seen in full consciousness, and based on insight. So based on so there are two ways of defining it. One was by hair, which was based on insight, whether the insight is present or absent. So if the insight is present, so it is more of a pseudo hallucination rather than a hallucinations. But this is very confusing because when we treat the patient with antipsychotics, generally they tend to regain some insight as we treat a partial insight at least. So what do we do with that? So that area is a gray area. So based on occurring in inner or outer perceptual space, Jaspers also defined pseudo hallucinations. So coming to the very interesting special hallucinations part. So I have mentioned 5.
Just before you get that, Dr. Vasudha, if you don't mind, I just wanted to let all the participants know that it'll be good if they can start putting in their comments or questions into the chat box. I see one already there. It'll be good if you can all start putting your questions there. Okay, and hopefully we'll have about 15-20 minutes of discussion. Okay. Thanks, Dr. Vasudha.
Coming to special hallucinations, this is very interesting. First, we will consider the functional hallucinations. So functional hallucinations are where external stimulus is necessary to provoke a hallucination. So the normal perception of the stimulus and the hallucination, same modality is experienced simultaneously. For example, if the fan is being switched on and the patient hears the fan going around, there is a noise. The patient hears this noise and it also starts off a person who is talking, the auditory hallucination. So he perceives the sound of the fan and also the person talking simultaneously. But these two perceptions happen in the same modality, for example, auditory modality. So patient can definitely say that the fan sound is different and the voice is different. So he can readily separate it, and it is very common in chronic schizophrenia. And how to distinguish this between an illusion? It is very simple. Illusion is a misperception. It's a transformation of the perception, whereas in hallucination, it is not the misinterpretation. Hallucination is different and the stimulus, which is the real perception, is different. So it is very clear there. So reflex hallucination, they are a form of synesthesia. So stimulus in one modality produces hallucination in another modality. Patient feels a pain in the head. For example, when her neighbor sneezes, she has a pain in the head. So the pain is occurring in a different modality and the sneeze is actually a auditory modality. So stimulus and the hallucinations are from different modalities. So when a person is intoxicated with LSD, he can be found as describing feeling, tasting, and hearing flowers. Extracampine hallucination is anything that occurs outside the limits of the sensory field. For example, all of you are hearing my voice, but if any person perceives it without the help of the internet, probably, it could be like an extracampine hallucination. So if I can hear a person talking in London and commenting upon me, it is a extracampine hallucination. Autoscopy or phantom mirror image. This is also very, very interesting. So experience of seeing oneself and knowing it is oneself from the viewpoint of one's own body. I am sitting here on this chair and I can see myself sitting on the other chair too. And I know that. And I can see myself walking around, probably moving my hand and talking to somebody. So it is a combination of visual hallucination and I can feel the limb moving, somatic sensation, and the kinesthetic sensation. All of them clubbed together give rise to autoscopy. So causes are varied: schizophrenia, delirium, epilepsy, lesions of parieto-occipital region, infections. All these can rarely give rise to autoscopy. The negative autoscopy is to look into a mirror and not seeing any image at all. It can also occur in organic states. Internal autoscopy is described in textbooks where a person can see his own internal organs. So coming to the hypnagogic hallucinations, and hypnopompic hallucinations. The way I remembered it during the PG days was when you are going to sleep, when you're hypnagogic, GO. So when the subject is falling asleep, that is when these hallucinations occur. Usually we may hear voices being called or a dog barking, or, subjects feel that they're fully awake. If you ask them, they feel that they're fully awake. But then when you do an EEG, generally the low alpha rhythm is found on the EEG. And it is very common, and it is 3 times more common than hypnopompic hallucinations. Hypnopompic hallucinations occur when the subject is waking up from sleep, and they can occur in narcolepsy. So we are coming to a very interesting, we are coming to conclusion of this presentation almost. Organic hallucinations. So we already saw the Charles Bonnet syndrome, and now we are coming to the phantom limb syndrome. When when we are a surgical resident, nobody mentions that there's a phantom limb syndrome. But then I had a patient when I was an intern. So the first limb was amputated. Now, due to diabetic gangrene, then there was a gangrene on the other limb. So this patient was the first person who introduced me to this fantastic, what I found very unbelievable at the MBBS level. I never felt that, okay, even this can happen. I saw very vividly. It usually occurs post surgical procedures like amputation, enucleation of eye, mastectomy, lineal amputation, remove larynx, and so the person has a perception of the part which has been amputated. So sometimes some patients can also have a third limb. Usually it can happen in thalamoparietal lesions. And parietal lobe lesions can also produce somatic hallucinations. So this very interesting field has been studied by our own Vilaynur Ramachandran. He's a very prominent researcher in this field, a prominent science writer. He has written a book called Phantoms in the Brain. So, and he devised a very ingenious method of treating phantom limb pain. Where the patient feels pain in the amputated limb. The limb is no longer there, but it feels very, very painful. So he introduced a mirror box where if one hand is amputated, so the patient keeps one hand and there's a mirror which reflects the normal hand as the other non-existent hand. So the patient can visually perceive that he has 2 hands. So with this being done, the patients experience some sense of relief in the phantom limb pain. It's truly interesting what he has done. So body image distortions. So this is a very vast this one. I'll try to wrap it up fast. So hyperskinesia is where the body parts are perceived as enlarged, as they are magnified. And the part of body which is magnified is usually also perceived as painful. For example, in Brown-Sequard syndrome, where there is a side with EPS, but it is also hyperschematic. The limb appears very heavy and it appears larger than the other side. So it can also occur in multiple sclerosis. It can also occur in thrombosis of posterior inferior cerebral artery occlusion. So in that, those two can produce unilateral hyperskinesia. So coming to hyposkinesia, it can occur in body parts either absent or diminished. Sometimes few patients of stroke may say that they do not have that limb altogether. So there is they do not perceive this limb. So body parts are absent. So it can also occur in parietal lobe lesions. Then paraskinesia is when body parts are twisted, perceived as twisted by the patient from the rest of the body. So it is somehow distorted compared to the rest of the body. So it can occur in hallucinogen use and in some forms of epilepsy. Then hemisomatognosis, unilateral lack of body image. So the one half of the body seems missing to the patient. So he cannot perceive one half of the body. So, and also this very interesting thing called anosognosia. So a paralyzed patient who is not able to move that side of the limb, or there is only limited movement in that side of the limb, but says that it is totally normal. So he denies the illness totally. So he feels what, nothing has happened to both of my limbs. They're both all right. So it is called as anosognosia. Somatoparaphrenia is a bizarre delusion where the patient attributes, for example, there was a patient who I have read probably in Oliver Sacks again, that, his distorted, his paralyzed limb actually belonged to the patient in the next bed. So it was not his limb at all. So it was a foreign limb. And he always used to complain that some other person's leg is actually touching his leg on his hospital bed. So it's a bizarre sort of delusion which can occur in few patients. So with this, I would like to wrap up this presentation. I would like to thank all of you for the patient hearing. Sir, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vasudha. I must say it was, you really covered a huge area. I mean, it's so common for residents to get used to thinking disorders of hallucination are about, perception are about distortions, illusions, and hallucination. And you brought in so many other themes into it. And I think it's it kind of, along the way, you kind of highlighted that we need to understand what is perception before we can start understanding the alterations that can happen in it, leading to what we see as psychopathology. So it was very, very lively and very comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much. There are a lot of questions there awaiting you. So you could turn on the chat as well. So would you like to see the chat and ask? Shall I ask the question? Here it says, Devshish Palkar says,
yes, sir.
Professors asks if hallucination started first or delusion started first. How to inquire, and if person becomes fearful after auditory hallucinations, should it be called secondary delusion?
So this will be clear to us only when we inquire, take more history. For example, there are concepts like delusional percept, when the person starts to feel something is not all right. So he might have formed the delusions, he might have elaborated the delusions from that point. So if the delusion is occurring post-delusion, post-hallucination, if the hallucination has occurred first and there's a delusional elaboration of that, definitely it's a secondary delusion.
Yeah. Before you go to the next question, I request all others who are not speaking to kindly keep their mics muted, please. Yeah. So here's a compliment to you, and then he goes on to ask you what are the specific questions you would ask to elicit auditory hallucinations.
So auditory hallucinations, generally patients come forth with it, saying that they are hearing voices, and they go on to describe. As you keenly listen to them, they will reveal the quality. So what we could do in this interview is to prompt them, when did it start, and how did it start, what was he doing at that time, what is the frequency, and where is it coming from, what direction it is coming from, whether it's a male or a female. So
please keep your mics muted, please. Yeah, go on.
Sir, actually it is coming from my house. I would like to it's my children. So
go on.
Difference between imagery and pseudo hallucination. So imagery is voluntary.
On that issue of, is it did the delusion come first, or is it like, is it a belief or perceptual abnormality? Yeah, like Dr. Vasudha mentioned, you really are looking at temporal relationship, definitely, right? But it's also useful. See, a lot of mental state examination understandings, descriptive psychopathology is all about how well we can converse with the patient and get all the details from him. So I think it will be useful to show a lot of curiosity in their experience, ask them to say, how did they come to know this? How did they come to know that? Okay, you can definitely have to ask what started first, but It can be nice if you ask them as a narrative. When did this thing start bothering you? When was the first time? Can you connect it with some event? Can you tell us how it all started? Where were you sitting? How did it start? If you have some kind of a very casual conversation with them, they might kind of start telling you what came, what was their initial abnormal experience, which started getting them to think. There is always with every perception, there are different stages. It's actual stimulation, of the actually sensory modality. Then how you organize it, it's based on different intensity of the stimulation or different components of the stimulation. There can be so much. So accordingly, the sensory perception is organized as to what all it is, and then there's an interpretation happening cognitively. And then, of course, memories are formed, and then you try to recall. There's a sense of familiarity when it kind of matches with the memory you're having. So there are different components to perception. So trying to look at each of these if you start talking to patients, and not so much like with the pen and paper, trying to just write down the whether a hallucination is present or not, but actually wanting to know them, wanting to understand them, wanting to understand how could any person have this kind of an unusual experience. The more I think we go into that kind of very very detailed discussion, it's more likely that the patients would actually volunteer and give you more information. They may even start asking you for clarification, saying, but when this happens, it goes like this. When this happens, it happens like that. So the more kind of details you ask, I think you will get very good, you will find that ability to kind of start distinguishing which came first. Where did the interpretation go wrong? Was it the stimulation of sensory systems at which point where the errors actually happened, or was it at the interpretation level the errors happened? I think it will be good to, and the only way therefore to elicit and get this answer to this question, which came first, is a lot of empathic interviewing of the patients. And you should see it not as a job, but as a kind of just coming to know another person who is having a very curious experience. I think that's what will actually give you, more likely give you these kind of resolution to these kind of questions. Yeah. Sorry, go on, Dr. Vasudha. The next question that.
So, sir, I would like to add here, because the history part, Jaspers was the first person who felt that there is a person beyond this experience. So we are all very much locked on to the eliciting of hallucination, eliciting of delusion. We want to write it down in the MSc and get over with it.
Yeah.
But then he was a person who was very person-centric, even before Carl Rogers came in with the person-centric therapy and stuff. So Jaspers was probably the first person who has been teaching us, this approach, exactly the approach you just mentioned.
Yeah, they'll like it actually. They will like it that you're trying to understand them, and they will actually, when come for follow-up, they'll tell you which component has actually changed. And you would have no doubt about the psychopathology you're actually determining. Okay, so yeah, true. There's always a person whose perceptions we are trying to assess. Yeah, very good. So you'd like to take the next question, Dr. Vasudha?
Can we call visceral hallucinations as somatic hallucinations?
Yeah. Dr. Harish, go on. Dr. Harish, you would like to answer live?
Sir, I was just telling that this question is being answered live by Madam. It's
Okay.
asking the question. Let Madam continue.
So visceral hallucination as a somatic hallucination. That was the question, is it not?
Can it be used interchangeably? Somatic hallucination and visceral hallucination.
Somatic hallucinations are slightly different from the visual hallucination. They are the more clearly you could describe this phenomenon, the better it would be, according to me. If it is coming from the viscera, like the internal organs, so it would be clearly a visceral hallucination.
Yeah.
So that would be my
Yeah, somatic hallucination would be a much more overarching term. It could also be, some sensations you're feeling from other parts of the body. Visceral hallucinations are all about actual, like she said, about from the internal organs. So, but within that, if it's from the internal organs, you want to use it interchangeably, I think that should be fine. There's a question requesting you to once again, difference between imagery and pseudo hallucination?
Pseudo hallucination. Imagery is actually voluntary and it is willed, whereas pseudo hallucination is not willful and it is involuntary, but the person has an insight into it. They recognize it as an unreal thing, but it is still occurring to them. So that could be a fundamental difference between the imagery and pseudo hallucination. So shall I go to the next question, sir?
It's a imagery may be often preceded by some kind of a thought or a memory or something, which kind of makes them almost call up the images, while hallucination would appear to have lesser control over that experience. The person might be able to have some control on imagery. He can kind of wish it away, but he may not be able to do that easily with the pseudo hallucination, though he might be able to do it much relatively easy compared to a true hallucination. Yeah. So it's both about sense of control and what cues it off and what kind of insight you have into it. And yeah, so go on.
Another example, again, can you give me an example of
pseudo hallucination?
So pseudo hallucination is one which has all the qualities of a hallucination. For example, I am able to hear some sound, probably some two people talking about me. You know, I'm able to hear the sound, whereas when I see that there are no people around, so there is a conflict in what I perceive. So I know that this may not be a real thing happening in external reality. So that is when it is a pseudo hallucination. It has all the qualities. It's involuntary, it's unveiled, it is intrusive, it is occurring on its own, and it has a clarity of a real percept. So everything matches a hallucination, whereas I can see through it partially or fully that it is not a real percept. So that would be an example that I could give.
Okay, go on. How about disorders of perception?
Perception different from various forms of delusion.
Delusions.
Delusions are basically thought disorders where there is a disorder in the thought process. So it is not coming from the sensory organs as such. So the input is not from the sensory organ and it is not being perceived in a, it's not a false perception actually. So thought is different and a perception is different. Thought is something which occurs internally. Okay, so the whole delusion concept, the whole delusion realm comes in the realm of thoughts rather than perception. So that is the fundamental difference in between these two important topics.
How do you differentiate somatic hallucination and a somatic delusion?
Somatic hallucination usually stop with the experience, the percept. If a person says that he is feeling this sensation from the body, probably from the leg or the hand or whatever. So the experience without any stimulus, that is the hallucination. Whereas a somatic delusion, it will have a explanation for it. The delusional elaboration happens. So there is a morbid thought process which goes into a delusion.
We just talked about the stages of perception, about stimulation, then the actual stimulation, then the organization of different components of the stimulus, which makes the wholesome perception, then the interpretation of what it is. Yeah. So I think if the somatic delusion, you'll probably find in the report from the patient, the interpretation part is quite significantly more than the perceptual effects that he might be able to describe. That comes closest to distinguishing it, but when there is a sensation which you can't really catch on to, like something coming from parts of the body, and you know, when they go on to talk about a lot of decisions based on that and all, somewhere this idea about is it from the thought or perception might kind of blur. But definitely, if you kind of recognize the stages of perception and look for the actual stimulation and what are the details of the perception, and then ask for how does he make out what it is and so on, gradually you may find that you will be able to distinguish between a somatic hallucination and a delusion. Yeah. Dr. Vasu, is autoscopy be a phenomena?
Depersonalization. Autoscopy. It can occur, I think. Not very sure here. Okay, so I will let that pass.
It can definitely happen. can definitely happen, but it is, otoscopy doesn't necessarily have to be absolutely identical to what one is, or exact mirror equivalent of, as if seeing in the mirror. But yes, it comes close to that. But one person can say that, he can see it, but he can almost see the nose misshapen, or as if the ears are growing bigger and bigger and coming down or something. So, the otoscopy can be kind of one component of the depersonalization, but these are very rare experiences. And some of these could happen very momentarily as part of temporal lobe phenomena.
Next question is it easy to differentiate disorders of perception like illusions, pseudo hallucinations, and hallucinations in a very busy OP setting? So this question is very important because in a busy OPD setting, the rapport building time is very less, and there will be a lot of pressure on the clinician. But what I have seen is there will be, if you're able to dedicate some time in the first interview, and the second interview you can dedicate some more time. So probably over serial mental status examinations, it will become much more clearer. So this has happened to me where the first interview did not make it very clear, but then the same patient comes in next week. So when we question him even more, so we are able to elicit some more aspects of his experience. So usually in most of the cases, we are able to elicit, hallucinations and illusions and delusions, all these phenomena. But there are some cases where they may not fully reveal, the patient may not be comfortable talking to you in a very busy OP, he may not reveal much. But as you build rapport and with subsequent MSCs, probably we will get a better idea. And this question goes on to ask, neuroimaging wise, which is better, fMRI or structural MRI? Is this to confirm psychiatric diagnosis? So this question is a little bit, I couldn't understand it very clearly.
Well, Dr. Rao has very clearly indicated that a good clinical interview should probably help avoid the MRI part of understanding the phenomena. Yeah, but there are some fascinating functional studies on how one perceives, one actually hallucinates, and how to kind of identify at the point in time when the person is hallucinating. Some very pairing fMRI studies with evoked potentials to find out. And of course, the patient has to really cooperate by telling and pointing out whenever they're actually hallucinating inside the scanner. So some excellent, interesting studies are there. It'll be nice for postgraduates to go back and read about some of these things. That said, for clinical assessment, they're really not really required. But since we are talking about descriptive psychopathology largely as part of the series, there are descriptive, the other part of psychopathology is analytical psychopathology. You can approach it from various schools of thought, but you can also approach it from the school of neuroscience as one school of thought by itself. Then if you want to think through from the looking for explanations about how these are happening, then maybe these kind of investigative approaches, not diagnostic at this point in time, but investigative approaches can be helpful. But definitely a clinical interview would be the best companion we can have at this point in time. Yeah.
There is another question which asks how to elicit hallucination if the patient is guarded and there is very poor rapport. This frequently happens in a large setting where we admit patients. So the patient might not have told you anything at all about his psychopathologies, but then we get very valuable information from serial MSCs one, and we also get very valuable information from the behavior of the patient. Although the patient may not reveal their hallucinatory content to the clinician, they may act upon it. So we may have to take that as a cue and try to talk to this patient as to why he did what he did. I am remembering one case from SIMS where there's a patient who was admitted, a Greek patient, and then they decided to teach Greek. Then the patient told, why do you need to teach Greek? Everybody in this ward speaks Greek. So that is what she was hearing, but she never actually revealed that to the clinician. So, but she used to get angry. She used to abuse the other patients. So that is how sometimes we will trace it back from the behavior to the perceptual disturbance. So it is better done in an IP setting. OP setting, if the patient is very guarded, it is very difficult. I agree with this question.
We can probably leave the fleeting hallucinations bit, a very temporal kind of decision making. Can you explain somatic passivity at the same time also distinguish it from somatic hallucination?
Somatic passivity phenomena is where the person's boundaries of self and the external are severely disturbed. So the person feels that their body is being moved without their voluntary effort. So whereas in a somatic hallucination, the patient feels that there is an abnormal sensation coming in from the body. So the sensation is interpreted in an abnormal manner. Whereas passivity is when the boundaries between self and the external are totally erased, and they feel that somebody else is making them do certain things, certain actions.
Yeah, somatic hallucination, like Dr. Rao said clearly, is the perception from any part of the body, which can be external or internal. And we have talked about some of those examples already. Yeah, in the somatic passivity, there is the sense of not only having a sensation, the sensation is also very noxious in some way. It's kind of very troublesome. It's painful. It's never a very pleasant sensation. It's like a very troublesome and then at least an awkward and embarrassing sensation, but most probably a painful and a noxious sensation. And there is also the idea that it's being actually, it's attributed to another force or agent, some other person or something. So there's a new component of agency also coming into it, that there is an experience and there is an agency that is external to that individual. And also there is a third component of being absolutely helpless against this agent. So they have to keep experiencing it, so they're struggling with it. So somatic passivity is a much higher, it's actually written as a delusion of somatic passivity. It's not written as a perceptual abnormality, but it's kind of referred to as a delusion of somatic passivity. So it's an experience, but there is additional interpretation to it. So, and it's again, it's a first rank symptom. Not all somatic hallucinations are first rank symptoms, but this kind of somatic passivity experience is almost the pathognomonic of schizophrenia. Well, somatic hallucinations can be due to many other conditions as well. So I think there's a raised hand. Somebody wanted to ask something, I feel. If you could raise hand, I mean, I can't see the full screen of all the participants, but I saw something like 2 people had raised hand. It said, not sure if you can locate the persons again. But if you want to ask your questions, you can. Dr. Vasudha, if you can see on the screen anybody with a raised hand, you can go ahead. And I think one useful way is to keep it in the participant list mode, I think. That might help us see the.
No, sir.
Good evening, madam. It was a wonderful presentation. Madam, I have just one comment rather than a doubt for clarification. Do you think that you have mentioned it occurs subject space? And a lot of doubt that any hallucination.
Dr. Harish, yeah, we're not hearing you clearly. Would you like to quickly type it out or something? I mean, we're not able to hear you. There's some issue with the mic. If you can kindly.
Okay, I think he has left. he might re-log in again.
Yeah.
Wonderful, sir. It was wonderful.
I think it's a very good presentation. What I liked about your presentation, Dr. Vasudha, is you also brought an issue of agnosia. I think very often it doesn't get talked about because we talk about the deviances in the perceptual thing, but we don't talk about the absence of perception. And I think so that at a fundamental level, the stimulation, the organization are both suffering in agnosia. So they are not able, they may actually get the stimulation, but the organization of that stimuli into the perception is where things are going wrong. While in many others, later on, you find the interpretation that's going wrong. And sometimes it's the memory and the recall is where the actual abnormalities actually happen. So talking about agnosia was something very good. It will be useful taking a neuroscientific kind of viewpoint on this. I have a very common example that I give to students and often to patients also. It doesn't have to be limited to hallucinations. It can be used even for anxiety disorder patients. it's like, I can see that at least all the three videos that are visible on the screen right now, including myself, Dr. Narayan, and Dr. Vasudha, we are all wearing glasses. The thing is, it's the first time and we end up getting our glasses. I mean, it's a huge experience because you suddenly realize the world is so different, and you had somehow gotten used to thinking it was very different from that. And you suddenly realize this is how it is. And that clarity is something very striking. It never repeats itself so clearly after the first glass. It's only when you keep getting refractory error changes, you don't really reach there. But the first experience is quite striking. Alongside comes the experience that the drops they put in your eyes, there is such a big difference in the ambient light that you experience itself suddenly seems very different. That's when you realize that we probably don't even know what is the absolute level of light that is there, or absolute level of, one can make out a change. If I suddenly switch off the light or dim the light, we can make out the change. And I'm sure everybody can, watching it can make out that. But did it change from 150 lumix to 110 pixel per lumix for one person, or it changed in a different way to another person? There's no way of saying. So there is so much of our brain processes that involved in actually deciding what we are perceiving. And many of these are actually used by magicians in many ways to kind of, create illusions. All of us are aware that nowadays with these webinars going on all the time, all you need to do is try to put an extra backdrop to your screen, and you will suddenly find when you move your hand, suddenly your hand is cut, or the head moves, there's a lot of blobs coming on the head and things like this. These are common experiences in the pandemic of webinars we are having. So you will actually, then that, there is something that's going wrong in the actual stimulation that's happening that is reaching your brain, that kind of makes you. So there is a difference in the way the stimulation is coming, but there's a difference in the way interpretation. So the learned experiences that we have about what can and cannot happen is being brought to bear on that information. So that's why I feel it's very useful for us to understand the stages of perception, stimulation, organization, interpretation, memory, and sense of recognition, and then finally active recall. The more we kind of keep this in mind, one can also try and see the abnormality the patient is describing, at what level in the stage of perception it seems to be. That can often help us categorize psychopathology quite confidently. It includes things like perceiving one's own thoughts, becoming aware of thoughts, becoming aware that somebody else may be having a different impression from one. So in some way, this perception thing starts becoming more and more complex as you have layers and layers on it as it comes up. So then recognizing agency of it, this actual action or this thought or this idea, whatever experience is actually happening from who is the agent of that, who is creating that? Is it am I the agent or somebody else the agent? The common theory is that hallucinations are from internal experiences, but it's recognized as something external. So maybe the error is happening in terms of the agency being attributed to someone else, I guess. So, I mean, there are different ways that there are neurosciences teaching us about perception, which includes the various stages and recognizing agency and becoming aware of that and so on. I think the more we read about it, a lot of psychopathology might become much easier to elicit and understand, because not all two people are not same in the way they are hallucinating. I would refer you to a series of articles that came from Dr. Ramanathan from Institute of Mental Health, Chennai, who is no more now, but he probably lived around 80s and 90s. He's written so many articles in IJP about differences between male voices and female voices, differences between voices coming from the right side of the head and coming from the left side of the head, voices which there is comes in a rush like a pulse and then stops and then comes in a pulse, or that actually comes in a continuous state. To be honest, it was very prescient, because the modern day neuroscience is actually trying to understand hallucinations by breaking down possible components of hallucinations like this and trying to see what can be different across people. And the findings are really fascinating. So I would urge you all to start understanding, reading a bit of neuroscience of perception, and also start and then revisiting the topic of hallucinations, imagery, pseudo hallucination. You may be able to figure out a lot of differences yourself. Before we finish, there is one last question that we should probably address and close. Dr. Harish Kulkarni has written, PGs often come up getting between subjective space of pseudo hallucination and somatic hallucination, which occurs in physical subjective space? Please clarify once. I think basically what he wants to know is how does one understand the physical space from subjective internal space. So subjective internal space is more like it's a conceptual thing rather than an actual thing. And it's like the visuospatial sketch pad we'll talk about. Like, there's an internal sketch pad in which our thoughts, the writings are coming, and we see it as our, that is the internal space. I mean, that's where we are actually observing certain things. So while the physical space is about something coming from within the body or from within the bone or from some part of the liver or something like that, I think that probably is one of the internal subjective space. And there's a mix up with somatic hallucination. It's still not very clear in the question, but I think the question seems to refer to differentiation between internal subjective space versus external objective space. I'll request Dr. Vasudha to clarify that, and after that I'll hand it over to the organizers to complete the program.
So in my opinion, pseudo hallucinations are also perceived as coming from an external space, not from an internal subjective space. So it is very, very similar to a hallucination. That's what a pseudo hallucination is. So it is definitely coming from an external space. But somatic hallucination is definitely a sensation coming from within one's own body. So I think that would be a very important difference between the two.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Vasudha, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you for accepting our invitation as speaker. And I would like to thank Dr. Ashok MV sir for accepting our invitation to be the chairperson for this program. And already there were many participants, and we have overstood the time. Anyways, thank you for the organizers, Icon Life Sciences and Tele-Aragya team. And I think if Bijal sir is here, thank you very much, IPSKC, for carrying out this wonderful psychopathology series. Thank you one and all, and we will meet again next week on Friday at 7:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will we can log out, I think, sir. What's the we can log out?